Hello, and welcome back to History 101, World Civilizations to 1100. This is Professor Gaughan at Colorado State University in Pueblo. And we are in Unit 4, Religions and Belief Systems. And today I'm going to talk about the evolution of Judaism. One of the things about religion is that we tend to think of religions as static. That is, if you say, I am Jewish, then that means certain things, but it means certain things throughout all of history. And this is not necessarily the case. In fact, very often it's not the case at all. So today we're going to look at the evolution of a religion, in particular the evolution of Judaism. And the argument for today is that the Israelites' understanding of their God and their relationship to their God changed over the course of their history as a result of external and internal political developments. You might want to pause the video here so you can write down that thesis. And the argument today is taken primarily from Brendan Nagel's book, The Ancient World, A Social and Cultural History. So you might want to look at that directly too to get some more information. Of course, we historians always want to know what's your evidence. Well, our evidence for this evolution is the Bible, books in particular of the Old Testament, but this evidence is based primarily on a theory called the documentary hypothesis. This hypothesis is based on the recognition by scholars of certain inconsistencies or repetitions or even stylistic differences in the texts of the Pentateuch, or the Torah. And so basically, scholars looking closely at the text of the Torah or the Pentateuch found four major stylistic differences, and they look at then four main sources for the narrative that were then gathered together and constructed into the product as we more or less have it today, although there were changes even after this. Anyway, the four main sources are J, E, D, and P. J is the author of J uses Yahweh as the name for God. The author of E, God's name is presented as Elohim, Hebrew for God or power, and then later comes out as Yahweh. D is the source that wrote Deuteronomy and the other books you see here. And P is the so-called priestly material, using Elohim and El Shaddai as names for God. We're not so worried about all of these little pieces, except just to say that the argument about the evolution of Judaism is based on this hypothesis that certain parts of different books of the Bible were written at different times by different authors and in different circumstances. Okay, so that was the evidence, or that's the basis for this particular argument. Now I want to return to the argument about the evolution of the understanding of God and the evolution of the understanding of the Hebrews or the Israelites' relationship with God and how it changed in different political circumstances. So let's go back to the earliest history and the prehistory. In other words, that period before Moses to the time of Moses. Sometime, we don't know when, way back in time, some nomadic people entered into Canaan and Palestine from places further east. And later than that, these people move on to Egypt and are ultimately enslaved in Egypt. And they then leave Egypt in the first half of the 13th century, between 1290 and 1250 BCE. the God of these nomadic Israelites reflected the nomadic existence. So, nomadic values include things like siblinghood, hospitality, asylum, and vendetta or revenge. And these values are reflected in this austere desert God. The God is uncomplicated, the God demands loyalty, and the God is intolerant of rivals. So, Exodus 23 says, "You shall have no other God before me." The first great political change occurs when these tribal nomads settle down and become sedentary agriculturalists. So this happens from starting in around 1200 BCE. And the political circumstances are that we have this loose federation of tribes. They depend on agriculture for survival. They are, however, like I said, it's a loose federation, so there are independent clans and tribes that are making their own decisions, but they're also connected together in some ways. And as they settle down to become sedentary agriculturalists, they also start to imitate their neighbors. In other words, if they're going to start to practice agriculture, they're going to learn from the people who are already there practicing agriculture. This has an impact on the understanding of who the God is. Let me make it clear that I'm not talking about God changing. I'm talking about the perception of God changing over time. So let's consider this. Okay, so we've got these nomadic populations who then settle down and become agriculturalists. They start to copy their neighbors in the practice of agricultural methods. And these agricultural methods include not only the proper times for planting and harvesting and so on, the sort of what we would call a scientific method, but also the practice of religion. So the Canaanite god Baal is worshipped in the area of Canaan or Palestine. I realize that using Canaan or Palestine, either one, will get me into political trouble, so I will probably use them both interchangeably. So, the Israelites' God then adapts to this new circumstance. So we get two things that happen. We get the worship of Baal by the Israelites to some degree, and we also get the new fertility festivals of Yahweh. We get the Sukkot, Sukkot, the Feast of Ingathering, in other words, the harvest feast. And we also get this rule by God telling Moses in Leviticus book 23, God telling Moses that they should celebrate this festival and this fertility festival. Now the story in Leviticus comes before the Israelites are agriculturalists, but the theory, the documentary hypothesis suggests that this development actually occurred later and was imposed earlier. That is, when they were sedentary agriculturalists. So the Israelites, as they change their circumstances, their God also changes. From that austere desert God to, at least in part, a fertility God. And as I said, the reason for this is because in antiquity one did not really separate religion from other tools. So if the Palestinians or Canaanites who are present in this territory are having success, it's not just because of the scientific methods that they're using, but also because of the religious activities in which they are engaged. And so when the Israelites settle down, they also engage in different religious activities than they had engaged in before. So that's the first great political change. The second great political change comes with the unified kingdom under the three kings Saul, David, and Solomon. What we get with the unified kingdom is a new centralization of power. And this is centralization of human power, right? And human hands. And this is reflected in the God. So, there are tensions in the relationship between human authority and divine authority. Before, all the humans were at about the same level, but now you've got these humans who are far above the political circumstance of their compatriots. And as a result, you get some tension built in about whose authority exactly is it in the creation of this kingdom and in all the activities of the Israelites. Consider this, for example. So, David, in his military conquests, seizes an old Canaanite stronghold, which becomes Jerusalem. This is in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 10. And when he seizes it, this becomes David's city, right? The city of David is what Jerusalem is called. So it's interesting that it's called the city of David and not the city of Yahweh. So the Israelites still look to their God, still look to Yahweh, but they also depend on the kings. The kings also need to justify their place, and they do it in two significant ways. This goes back to our Unit 3 and the articulation of political power. The first way the Israelite kings, or one of the ways the Israelite kings justify their position or articulate their power, is in the physical world. It's during this period, under the reign of Solomon, that the first temple is constructed. In fact, we refer to the reign of Solomon until a little bit later, which we'll talk about, as the beginning of the first temple period. The Ark of the Covenant is also brought to Jerusalem until Harrison Ford comes and steals it. So religion now had a geographic center. Before this time, all the different tribes all had their own sort of religious practices as well as shared religious practices. But now there's one specific religious center in the kingdom to help create unity with the temple and the Ark of the Covenant. So the geographic center is important in the evolution of Israel. The second way in which the kings articulate their political power are attempts at literary unity. Between 950 and then after the demise of the kings, there are a number of writers working on writing a comprehensive historical narrative. So they take this whole collection of legends and songs and cultic practices and prayers and sayings and rituals and proverbs and laws and all these things that constituted the traditions of the different tribes, and they put them all together in one comprehensive historical narrative. They also collect and compose a history of the great deeds of their God, of Yahweh's great deeds, and in particular, the experience of Yahweh's people from the time of Abraham on. So during this period, this is what we call the book of J, okay? And during this period, the bulk of the material for the books of Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Judges, and Samuel is produced. Not all of it, but the bulk of it is produced during this period. And this we refer to as the book of J, where Yahweh's name is referred to as Yahweh. The third great political change comes after the demise of Solomon. And the third great political change is the division of the kingdom into two different kingdoms. Judah in the south, what you see in yellow on this map, and Israel in the north, what you see in that sort of peachy color on the map. And the city of Jerusalem is in the south, in Judah. There are two literary evolutions in Israel that go along with this political change, this division of the kingdom into two. One of these literary developments is the emphasis on historical narrative. There's an interest now in tracing how Yahweh acted on behalf of the Israelites, and how individuals and the Israelites as a whole had responded to the acts of Yahweh, and the connection between these two, the acts of Yahweh and the acts of the people in response to Yahweh. The other kind of literature that gets developed in this period is the so-called prophetic literature. Both the historical narrative and the prophetic literature are taking a critical look at the political circumstances of the Israelites in Judah and Israel. The historical narrative does it by exploring the historical past and the relationship with the God. The prophetic narrative takes a more direct approach. It basically assaults the evils of the day with sermons and with symbolic action. So some of the parts of Deuteronomy are written during this period. Another great political event that has an impact on Israel, and our fourth great political change, is the destruction of the kingdom of Israel. In other words, that northern kingdom was destroyed in 721. On our map on the slide here, we have the map of the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrian Empire basically destroyed Israel. And whoever they took captive at this point was dispersed around the Assyrian Empire and lost forever to history. So these people, we don't know what happened to them. If they just died off, if they converted to the religions in the location where they were, we just don't know. They vanish in history, the people who were removed from Israel when Israel was destroyed. The bulk of the theological traditions and literature, however, passed to Judah. So, although the people were lost, their literary works were not. Among these theological traditions that get carried on then in Judah after 721 are traditions regarding the covenant and the renewal ceremony held each year at the sanctuary of Shechem. Also, we get a particular viewpoint of the history of Israel that is eventually written down, and here's where we get the core of Deuteronomy. It's actually, the core itself is composed in the 6th century, but the argument is that these ideas come into place now. So let me give you two examples from Deuteronomy that give you a sense of the particular viewpoint of the history of Israel. The history of the Israelites. So in Deuteronomy 7, verses 7 to 9, we are told, out of all nations, God chose Israel to be a special possession, not because of any merit on its part, but solely because God loved it. So that's one piece of this viewpoint of the history of the Israelites. The second piece, also in Deuteronomy 6, chapters 4 to 5, or verses 4 to 5, excuse me. But God cannot be served with divided loyalty. Okay. So these authors after the loss of the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, accounted for bad things by people not living in accordance with the covenant. So that you start to get this notion that there's going to be a return to the ideal Davidic kingdom. That is, the kingdom named after David, right? Davidic is just David with an IC at the end. So there'd be a return to the ideal Davidic kingdom when all lived in accordance with God's rules. So this is a new sort of theology that comes into play in this period. We are going to return to the grandeur that we had when David was king of the Israelites. And the way to get there is by living in accordance with the covenant, with the rules that God has set forth for the people. But the larger political circumstances of the ancient Near East are going to play with the Israelites some more. The Assyrian Empire is going to be taken over by the Neo-Babylonian Empire, or the Chaldean Empire. And this is not, by the way, Hammurabi's empire, which is the old Babylonian Empire. This is the new Babylonian Empire. So if we go back over here in Mesopotamia, the Babylonians and the Assyrians have been duking it out for quite a long time. And so probably what happens to Judah, the kingdom that's still extant in the area of Palestine, is that since they were not mistreated by the Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians are suspicious of them. And so our fifth great political change comes when Nebuchadnezzar sacks Jerusalem, kicks the priests and other elite out of Jerusalem, and in fact causes them to be held in Babylon in captivity. So this is the fifth great political change, is the Babylonian exile, or the Babylonian captivity, which lasts from 586 BCE to 538 BCE. And this is when the priests and the powerful administration in Judah are living in exile in Babylon. A couple of serious issues face the priests in Babylon. First of all, Babylon is totally cool, okay? So think about this. Mesopotamia has this very, very old and rich religious tradition, very old and rich literary tradition. And you're coming from, this podunk place where you got the nice temple that was built, by the kings, but that has been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, so we're out of that. And you go to this place that has been the center of civilization for a very long time. And so what do you do? What do you do as an Israelite in exile? The priests don't want to be lost like earlier exiles had been lost. Okay, remember the folks from Israel, the northern kingdom, got dispersed into the Assyrian Empire and were never heard from again. So the priests who are removed and in captivity in Babylon are trying to maintain their religion, but they're trying to maintain their religion in the face of some pretty impressive religious beliefs that already exist, and traditions and buildings and all sorts of things that already exist. So one of the ways that they deal with this is they cling ever more dearly to Yahweh as the only God. Let's think about Worf for a minute. Okay, some of you probably are not Star Trek The Next Generation fans, so let me tell you a little bit about Worf. Worf is a Klingon. However, when he was very little, he was adopted into a human family, so he grew up on Earth, far away from Klingon traditions. But let me tell you, every single time that Worf meets a Klingon, the Klingon always makes the comment, "Worf, you are a true Klingon." Worf, growing up in exile from his home planet, holds on much more closely and dearly to the traditions of that planet than, in fact, the Klingons on Kling itself. So, admittedly, Worf is fiction. I know that. I don't want to offend anyone, but Worf is fiction. But the idea is there that growing up in exile causes you, if you have that intention, to cling more closely to your own traditions. And that's what the priests in Babylonian captivity also did. That is, in the face of all of that impressive Mesopotamian religious weight, they held on more closely to their own traditions. Here's some of then the theological developments that occur. They argue then, the priests in captivity argue that in 721, and then again in 586, the troubles that the Israelites had with the Assyrian Empire, then with the Babylonian Empire, had been the result of the failure to live in accordance with the law. And the idea is we can prevent this from happening again by our behavior. So what they did is they used the old writings that had already been existed, inserted new materials about cult practices and rituals. They composed and added the story of creation to Genesis. That's Genesis chapter 1:1 to 2:3. They organized material of the early history. So during the kingdom, we had the history from Abraham and later. But now they were looking at the early history from Adam to Abraham. Second Isaiah was composed during this period. That is chapters 40 to 66 in the book of Isaiah. They also compiled the Pentateuch, or the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So these were all, a lot of them had already, the substance of them had already largely been written, but they compiled them and organized and put them together as one unit. And the work that they wrote is referred to as the Book of P. I remember we said it early on in this talk, the priestly books. The God also changes. And again, I'm not talking about actual God changing. I'm talking about the notions of God changing. That Yahweh is above and beyond the polytheistic battles of the other gods. The deities of nations pale in comparison to the God of everything. They pale so much in comparison that they cease to exist from the perspective of the Israelites. So 2nd Isaiah, again, chapters 40 to 66 in the book of Isaiah, says, God has no need of temples or kingdoms. God is more concerned with the human spirit. Isaiah 66:1, heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. What counted also then was not God's physical presence, but God's spiritual presence. If God is not fettered by a temple or by a people, then God becomes the God of everyone, and indeed the only God. So one might argue that these are the first signs of true monotheism in the Israelite religion. So the Israelites in captivity, in the face of Mesopotamian civilization and religion, respond by changing their perception of God so that God becomes not just the God of the Israelites, but the God of everyone. And God has no need of a physical presence. That is, that there's not the need for the temple. There's not the need to be in Jerusalem to worship the God and to believe the God. So the priests come up with these ideas in exile, but exile ends. we have our sixth great political change, thanks to the conquests of Cyrus the Great. Now, we've already talked about the impact of the Persian Empire on Greek identity and the conflicts with the Greeks in the West. We've also talked about the impact of the Achaemenid Persian Empire on India, with the rise of the Mauryan Empire, the first empire in India. Now we're going to talk about the impact of the Persian Empire on Jerusalem and the Israelites. So here are our priests in Babylon, in captivity in Babylon. When the Persian Empire defeats the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and in fact creates this whole massive empire we already talked about many times, and the priests in Babylon, and indeed everybody else in captivity in Babylon, there's not just people from Israelites, but people from all over the Assyrian Empire, get told they can go back home. Cyrus says, go ahead, go back home. The priests return to Israel. And they become one of many little regions of the Persian Empire from the political point of view of the Persians. Mind you, not all the priests choose to return home. Babylon's kind of, like I said, a really cool place, so some folks want to stay. But many of them do, in fact, return home. And we get our sixth great political change, post-exilic Israel. Exilic looks like a scary word, but it just means exile. It's just the adjective formed out of the noun exile. So after the exile, Israel after the exile. Now, politically, Israel is not an independent kingdom, but an insignificant temple state in the large Persian Empire. But in this period, they rebuild the temple. So we get the beginning of the Second Temple period here in 538. And also part of the political story is that Jerusalem has some relatively strong governors. One of the strongest of them is Nehemiah. And Nehemiah tries to recreate the Jerusalem as a powerful city. So we've got the rebuilding of the temple, but we also have Nehemiah's other great projects, fortification of the city, in particular rebuilding the walls of the city and making the city stronger. And he also requires that every family in the territory of Judah send 10 members to Jerusalem. So every family is represented in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem itself is repopulated. Nehemiah's task was physical, but the glorious restoration of the kingdom promised by the prophets after the divided kingdom is now postponed. We don't really have an independent glorified kingdom. We have a little temple state. So we have a second temple, but we don't have what we expected, the restoration of the great kingdom of Saul and David and Solomon. So the Israelites still have a challenge before them. You've got the Israelites in Judah itself who are needing to figure out how to live until the promises of the restoration are fulfilled. And for those outside of Israel, the difficulty was how to be Jewish without being close to the temple and without being surrounded by other Jews. So more and more in post-exilic exile, the thing that identifies someone as Jewish is the observance of Mosaic law. So what determined whether you belong to the community of Israel was not location, but observance of law. All right? It was pretty much agreed that it was a failure to live in accordance with Yahweh's rules that caused the destruction of the kingdom of Israel and also the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the Babylonian captivity. So, what precisely were those rules what were the expectations of their God. Before the Second Temple period, the covenant had been somewhat loosely defined, sort of prescriptive rules regarding moral behavior and ritual and worship. But now, in post-exilic Israel, or Judah, these rules become constitutional mandates. The key to proper behavior was whether a particular action was or was not in conformity with the laws of Israel and the terms of the covenant. So knowledge of the law became essential. And this new era is inaugurated sometime around 400 BCE, when the scribe Ezra read out the Mosaic law to the assembled community at the temple and explained the law to the community. And then we had the Feast of the Tabernacles, the celebration of the dwelling place of the divine presence, the Shekinah, the divine presence. After the feast, the people gathered, and remember now, people are there from all over Judah because Nehemiah had repopulated the city. So people gathered in Jerusalem and at the temple for the feast. Afterwards, solemnly committed themselves to observe the law and all its requirements. And since that time, study became an essential part of the Judaic tradition. And in fact, it still is today. Knowledge of the law and study of the Torah is crucial, is sort of a crucial definition for being Jewish. Here's the other important change that has an impact not just on the Jews, but on other Christians that other religions that evolve out of Judaism, in particular Christianity. And that is, back in the 600s, the author of Deuteronomy had foreseen the reestablishment of the kingdom of David as human and national power, right? That we were going to reestablish a human kingdom. But now we get this notion that the kingdom of God is not going to be on the earthly plane. The kingdom of God is going to be somewhere else. The kingdom of God is going to be in heaven. So this is the story of the evolution of Judaism into monotheism, into the importance of the law, and into this notion of the restoration of the kingdom not really being on earth. And all of these things, of course, have had a long life afterwards. I just want to do a little epilogue here. As you know, the Persian Empire is taken over by the Greco-Macedonians under Alexander the Great. And during this period, there's more literature that's written. The apocryphal books are written during this period. And then, from the point of view of the Israelites, the next invaders or conquerors were the Romans. And it's during the reign of the Emperor Augustus that Judah becomes a province of Rome. You've already met, of course, Augustus when we looked at the deeds of the divine Augustus. And you have already met Vespasian when we looked at the laws concerning Vespasian's powers. But Vespasian also is the one to bring an end to the Second Temple period. He, with the help of his sons, destroys the temple, and the Roman army, destroys the temple at Jerusalem, and in fact puts an end to any Jewish power in Jerusalem. And in fact, there is no Jewish state again, independent Jewish state again, until the 20th century CE. So the destruction of the Second Temple was the end of the Israelites as sort of a unified nation, but obviously not the end of the Israelites or the Jews as a religious people. Thank you for your time. I look forward to talking about this a little bit more in class after you've had a chance to look at some of those primary sources and a little bit about the documentary hypothesis.